Imagine the sky going dark in the middle of a clear day. Not for a minute and not for an hour, but for long years. The sun hangs overhead as a dim red spot and no longer warms. Snow falls in summer. Rivers freeze where they never knew ice. People look up and understand only one thing. This is the end of the world. More than one catastrophe in our history looked like this. Many of them looked like this. And every time, someone stayed alive, and then told their children what they had seen. These stories survived thousands of years and reached us. We know them as myths of the flood, of the wrath of gods, of the death of all things. But behind each such myth stands a real event, a real catastrophe that living people saw with their own eyes. Today, we will pass through 7 such catastrophes. From the most ancient, which nearly wiped out our whole kind, to the one that gave the North its legend of the end of the gods. Let us begin with the most distant and the most terrible. About 74,000 years ago, on the island of Sumatra, the volcano Toba awoke. This was not just an eruption, but a blast on a planetary scale. The supervolcano threw thousands of cubic kilometers of ash into the sky. The cloud covered half of the Earth and shut out the sun. Scientists call such a thing a volcanic winter. For years it grew cold, plants died, finding food became almost impossible. By one version, it was then that humanity stood at the very edge. Supporters of this hypothesis believe only a few thousand people remained alive. Our whole species shrank to the size of one small tribe. If this is true, every person living today descends from a handful who survived that winter. But this story has another side as well. Modern geneticists increasingly doubt the catastrophic scenario. Stone tools are found both below Toba's ash layer and above it. So people lived there both before the blast and right after it. Perhaps our ancestors proved far tougher than it is usually thought. Only one thing is known for certain. This was one of the grandest eruptions in all human history. And the memory of it remained not in legends, but in our own blood. Let us move closer to an age when people had already spread across Europe. About 8,000 years ago, off the coast of Norway, something happened that no one expected. A huge section of an underwater slope suddenly collapsed into the ocean. Geologists call this the Storegga slide. So much earth slid into the deep that it could have buried a whole country. From the blow, a wave rose across the sea that we today would call a tsunami. It crashed onto the shores of Britain, Norway, and distant islands. But its main victim was a land that is no longer on the map. Back then, Britain was still joined to the mainland by a wide plain. Scientists gave it the name Doggerland. It was a green country with rivers, hills, and hunters' camps. The wave rolled across it as a wall of water and mud. And behind it, the sea rose, year after year, taking the land. In the end, Doggerland vanished under the waters of the North Sea forever. A whole country with its people, paths, and stories went to the bottom. And here is born an image we will meet more than once. A sunken land, a perished world, a homeland swallowed by the sea. Many peoples keep legends of countries gone beneath the water. Perhaps the oldest of them were born right here, on the shore of a vanished plain. Let us go on, and again to the water. About 7,500 years ago, in the south, another disaster struck. Where the Black Sea splashes today, there lay a freshwater lake. It was far smaller than today's sea, and its shores fed whole settlements. People plowed the land, herded cattle, and did not know they lived in a trap. The level of the world ocean was slowly rising after the Ice Age. And one day the water broke through the narrow strait of the Bosphorus. By one version, the breakthrough was sudden and furious. A salt torrent poured into the lake with the force of hundreds of waterfalls. The water rose swiftly, flooding shore after shore. Whole villages went under the water within a few days. People could only flee inland, abandoning their homes. Two geologists studying the bottom found a trace of that event. Shells of freshwater and marine creatures lay there in clear layers. They suggested that this very catastrophe gave rise to a great myth. The myth of the worldwide flood, known to almost all the peoples of the earth. Skeptics argue and say that the water came in slowly, but the image remained. The sea that burst into the home of man and flooded a whole world. And now we come to the most famous flood of antiquity. About 5,000 years ago, on the banks of the rivers Tigris and Euphrates, lived the Sumerians. This was one of the first great civilizations in history. They had cities, writing, and clay tablets with stories. Archaeologists digging the ancient city of Shuruppak found a strange layer, a thick stratum of river silt that split the city's history in two. This was the trace of a tremendous flood that destroyed a whole settlement. And now, the most astonishing part. On clay tablets is written a tale of that flood. In it, the gods decide to destroy people with a great water. But one man builds a large ship and saves his family. He takes animals with him and rides out the flood on the water. When the water recedes, he releases a bird to look for land. Do you recognize this story? It was written down 1,000 years before the Bible. The Sumerian righteous man was called Ziusudra. Later, he was called Utnapishtim. And later still, the same story became the legend of Noah. So a local flood in the valley of two rivers turned into an eternal myth. A real catastrophe, lived through by a handful of people, traveled across half the world. And it lives to this day in the sacred books of different peoples. The fifth catastrophe is fire, not water. About 3,500 years ago, thunder roared in the Aegean Sea. On the small island of Thera, a monstrous volcano awoke. Today, this island bears the beautiful name Santorini. Back then, it exploded with a force that is hard to imagine. The top of the mountain vanished, and a huge crater opened in its place. The sea poured into it and gave birth to waves of unheard-of height. At that time, a brilliant Minoan civilization flourished nearby. Its center was the island of Crete, with palaces and a fleet. The Minoans built aqueducts and painted their walls with bright frescoes. They were the most skilled seafarers of the ancient Mediterranean. And then Santorini's ash covered their fields and harbors. A tsunami crashed onto the shores and smashed the ships. The city of Akrotiri on Thera itself was buried under ash entirely. The Minoan power was shaken and, in time, faded away. Many scholars link this blast with the legend of Atlantis, with a great sea power that went under the water in a single day. Plato described it 1,000 years after the catastrophe. This link cannot be proven, and most historians treat it with caution. But the coincidence is captivating. A flourishing island civilization destroyed by sea and fire all at once. The sixth catastrophe was neither a blast nor a wave. It came quietly, and for that it proved even more terrible. About 3,200 years ago, a drought descended on the eastern Mediterranean. The rains left year after year, and the fields stopped bearing. Scientists studied ancient pollen and the rings of trees. They found that this was the driest time in the whole Bronze Age, and yet the world then was surprisingly developed and connected. Egypt, the Hittites, the Mycenaeans, the cities of Syria traded with one another. This was the first global network of peoples in history. And this network collapsed almost at once, as if by someone's order. Hunger drove people from their settled places in search of bread. By sea and by land moved crowds of refugees and warriors. The Egyptians recorded them under the mysterious name of the Sea Peoples. Cities burned, kingdoms vanished, writing in places was forgotten entirely. The great civilization of bronze crumbled within a few decades. In its place came dark ages, of which almost nothing is known. Here there is no single hero and no single villain. There is only climate, hunger, and the fragility of a connected world. And this is perhaps the most disturbing lesson of all. Sometimes the end of the world comes not with thunder, but with the silence of a withered field. And the last catastrophe, the closest to us in time. In the year 536 of our era, the sky over Europe went dark. This is not a legend. This is written by eyewitnesses of that time. A Roman historian named Procopius left frightening lines. He wrote that the sun shone without brightness, as if in eclipse. A dim haze hung over the land for a year and a half on end. Snow fell in summer. The harvest perished. Famine began. Modern scientists found the cause in the ice cores of Greenland. A huge eruption threw a veil of ash and sulfur into the sky. It shut out the sun and brought down the temperature across the whole north. Historians call this the beginning of one of the worst times to be alive. And half the population of Scandinavia may have died of cold and hunger. And here is what is astonishing. The northern peoples have a myth of the Fimbulwinter, of a terrible winter 3 years long without a single summer. In their legends, this winter foretells Ragnarök, the death of the gods and the world. Many researchers believe the myth was born precisely then, from the memory of a real darkness that covered the north in the 6th century. People survived a true end of the world and turned it into a sacred legend. 7 catastrophes, 7 times humanity stood at the very edge. Eruptions, floods, tsunamis, droughts, and darkness in the middle of the day. Each time it seemed this was the end of all living things. And each time, someone survived to tell of what they had lived through. In this lies the main thought of our story. Myths of the end of the world are not the inventions of frightened savages. They are memory. Memory of real pain and real fear pressed into legend. Our ancestors could not explain a volcano or a shift in climate scientifically, and they spoke in the only language they understood, the language of myth. The wrath of gods, the punishment of the heavens, the price of sins. But beneath these images, the same thing was always hidden. Fragile man before the face of an indifferent and immense nature. We too live today on the same restless planet. Beneath us, volcanoes still breathe, and the climate still changes. The only difference is that now we can read these signs. And perhaps the main meaning of the ancient legends lies in this. They whisper to us from the depth of millennia one simple and important thing. This has happened before. We survived it. Try not to forget. If this story made you think, write in the comments. Which ancient mystery or catastrophe should we take apart next time? The most interesting ideas I always take into work. We also have a Telegram channel where materials come out that do not make it here. Come in if you want to descend into the depth of these stories even further.